Hey there, this is Ari. Welcome back to the Energy Blueprint podcast. Today I have with me for, I believe, the third, at least, maybe fourth time, Alex Leaf, who is a good friend of mine and now partner in the Energy Blueprint, someone who works with me, who is the co-author of my upcoming book on sunlight, which is going to be an epic book, by the way.
Yes.
I'm sure Alex can attest to that.
Yeah.
And he's someone that I hired because he's just absolutely brilliant at what he does as a health researcher and writer. He's got as far as formal credentials, he's got a master's in nutrition. He's a former lead researcher on Examine.com's team, which is one of the top websites, if not the top website on the subject of, compiling scientific research around specific nutritional supplements. And he's been an amazing boon to the Energy Blueprint as far as sharing his knowledge and helping me to co-create programs and co-write the next book. So welcome back for the fourth time. Alex, such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Ari. I really enjoy being on these podcasts. It's always fun to chat with someone who is able to actually have a stimulating conversation.
Yes. Thank you. I'll take that as a compliment.
Yeah, no, it definitely is.
So we've been doing a lot of these lately. We've been doing about 1 billion live Q&As for the members of our Fat Loss Blueprint program that we released a couple months ago. So it seems like we've been seeing a lot of each other virtually, even during COVID.
Yep.
But yeah, let's get into it. That was probably why it's so hard for me to keep track, whether this is your third or fourth time or 25th time, because I've done so many of these calls with you lately. But today we are going to be talking about a really, really important subject, and one that admittedly I have somewhat neglect to talk in depth on, and partly because it has not really been studied formally in that many studies, and it's something that's really important, but is something that in general, there's no sort of official body of knowledge on this particular topic. And the topic is the connection between being overweight, increased levels of body fatness, and fatigue. So how body composition factors into your energy levels. And like I said, this is really something that the actual sort of formal body of scientific evidence hasn't really explored that specific topic in great depth. We can't refer to 25 studies that have specifically and explicitly tested that relationship and explained it and outlined all the mechanisms. So what this involves is really more of piecing together lots of bodies of data that are somewhat disconnected, and then piecing together the physiological mechanisms and kind of understanding the relationship in the context of overall metabolic health and human physiology. And this is something that Alex and I have done in great depth over the last couple years now. And he in particular, it has amazing levels of expertise on the subject of body composition and body fatness and fat loss. And so I asked him to take that body of knowledge, and together we kind of connected the dots around how all of those, those elements of metabolic health that relate to body fatness connect with physical energy levels and, mitochondrial energy production and so on. And he's done an absolutely brilliant job of that. And I wanted to bring him on the podcast to talk about that. So first of all, Alex, let's just talk about the prevalence of fatigue, and I guess the prevalence of obesity and overweight in the general population, and kind of just overarching sort of context that you want to present to people as the big picture framework to understand this discussion.
Yeah. So I think that a really good place to start with this is to just have people, to have everyone listening right now, just picture fatigue in your mind. Like, what comes to mind? Maybe you caught a cold, or you got a bad night of sleep, or maybe you had to take some medications or something that just kind of killed your energy levels. And I mean, when you think about fatigue, fatigue itself is a symptom, but what are all of the associated symptoms that fatigue itself encompasses? Because I don't think a lot of people appreciate it. Whenever you're feeling weak, whenever you have difficulty being active, whenever you have difficulty concentrating, or you have memory problems, or you have emotional instability, all of these things are considered fatigue. Because in essence, fatigue isn't just about being tired. It's not just about, physically not being able to do things. It's also not having the mental capacity to sustain mental work or emotional control. And so I think when we put fatigue in that expanded spotlight, we start to realize, oh, this is actually something that probably affects a lot more people than I think. And if that's what you think, then you would be right. Because surveys of the US population have shown that only 1 in 4 adults in the US has no symptoms of fatigue whatsoever. And you can guarantee that it's going to mostly be younger adults. Once you hit middle age and older, you start to see that 1 in every 3 men complains about having fatigue, and 1 in every 2 women, literally half of like all middle-aged and older women in the US, complain of having fatigue problems. And this isn't temporary fatigue either. This is literally like chronic fatigue. Like every day I wake up and I just feel tired. I can't concentrate. What do I do? And so,
by the way, just to add to that, I've seen
yeah,
one study specifically in adults over the age of 65 that showed that 1 in 3 suffers from severe, debilitating levels of fatigue. 1 in 3. So, I mean, it's extraordinarily common, and I like how you grounded that in kind of the age gaps. Like, it's unlikely for a teenager to be expressing tons of chronic fatigue, but the older you get, the more that these issues at the nutrition and lifestyle level tend to add up, and that ultimately sort of degrade and cause dysfunction in your physiology that ends up leading to fatigue.
Yeah, well, I mean, just as kind of another data point I find interesting, about 25% of all office visits involve fatigue as one of the complaints.
Doctor's office.
And yeah, so when people actually finally decide, hey, I should go to the doctor's office, 25% of the time it's because of something that involves fatigue.
Mm-hmm.
And you end up then having, of all the people that go into a doctor's office, 1 in 5 people, so 20% of people, end up meeting the diagnostic criteria for chronic fatigue syndrome. And I think that one of the issues with this is that so there's this thing about relativity, right? Where if you feel really crappy for a long period of time, you become accustomed to it. And I think this is a huge issue with fatigue, because I think people start to feel fatigued, but they don't do anything about it. And so they go so long feeling fatigued that they don't even remember what it's like to not be fatigued. They think that how they feel is actually normal when it's, anything but normal. It's just that
and to add to that, the external cues also are reinforcing that, because so many other people are also chronically fatigued, and we've almost glorified and made it a badge of honor to say like how little sleep we're getting, and how hard we're working and how busy we are, and we kind of tend to brag about those things, but those are the very things that are major contributors to fatigue. And so many people external to us are also fatigued, that it's easy for people to end up thinking, oh, it's normal for everybody to be just chronically low energy and burnt out, and struggling to wake up in the morning, and so on.
And I mean, frankly, the environment outside of the people also facilitates it, because somebody's fatigued, yet all they do is sit around all day, drive in a car to get to work. They take escalators instead of stairs. They just sit all day. It's like they've never actually really have an opportunity for their body to show them how fatigued they really are, because they're not doing anything that really requires energy.
Right.
And so, I mean, yeah, between what you said with other people making it seem normal, because, hey, I'm just like them, so I'm normal, and then dealing with it for long periods of time, and then having an environment that facilitates it, I think that it's really no surprise a lot of people have fatigue, and they probably don't even know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. So speaking of, I guess, let's jump into the overweight and the body fatness part of
Yeah.
this. So in this big picture of causes of fatigue, and obviously the energy blueprint really revolves around the work that we do revolves around building out this paradigm of what are the causes of fatigue, what are the factors that influence the regulation of human energy levels and that cause fatigue, or that we can manipulate to get our energy back, to optimize our energy levels, to achieve superhuman energy levels. That's what we do, and obviously that story is very complex. From looking at it from multiple layers, as far as the nutrition and lifestyle factors to the physiological mechanisms and how mitochondrial function and brain function and inflammation and gut health and the microbiome and liver function, and all these different layers to the story, how light ties into it, the subject of our next book, how hormesis ties into it, all of these different factors, how they regulate this complex mix of physiological variables that influence our energy production. But within that very complex sort of spider web of interrelationships, where does body fatness fit into this picture?
Well, I think if I had to put body fat somewhere in the picture, I would probably roll it up into like a little glob of paint and then just throw it against the wall and watch it splatter. and I say that because being overweight or obese has a very bidirectional relationship with both chronic fatigue and a lot of factors that contribute to fatigue. So, I mean, just at like a very high level, think about mitochondria. If you have mitochondrial dysfunction, that's going to contribute to fatigue, and that could contribute to energy imbalances and weight gain over time. But if you are overweight or obese, that creates an internal environment that is damaging to mitochondria, which then contributes to fatigue. And it's the same with circadian rhythms. People with obesity have difficulty sleeping because of structural changes that happen with their airways due to the excess fat pads. And that interferes with circadian rhythms. It interferes with mitochondrial function. And all of those things feed back into perpetuating fatigue and obesity. So I think the first thing to understand here is exactly what you mentioned earlier, which is this is a very complex web of relationships. And so that's what I would like people to understand first, is that when we talk about overweight or obesity, it's going to be touching on a lot of things that all feed back into itself and then also feed into energy levels.
Mm-hmm. What if you were to quantify it? I'm curious what your answer to this would be. If you were to quantify how common this is, poor body composition, excess levels of body fatness, as a contributing factor to fatigue, I guess how prevalent it is as an explanatory factor among the portion of the population that's experiencing fatigue. Do you have any thoughts on that? This is, I'm sure, speculative, but I guess we have data on, what proportion of the population is overweight, and maybe there's some sort of extrapolation here. I'm just curious what your general sense is.
Yeah, well, I mean, amusingly enough, and while I understand that this is a little fallacious in terms of logic, 3/4 of the population complains of some form of fatigue, and 3/4 of the population is either overweight or obese. But we do actually have meta-analyses that have studied tens of thousands of adults, and they show that being obese is associated with a 40% greater chance of suffering from fatigue than if you were to be at a healthy body composition, and that people with overweight or obesity on average suffer from about a 10% reduction in their feelings of vigor and vitality. And 10% might not seem like a lot, but I mean, I wish I had something off the top of my head to quantify this, but
the problem with a stat like that is it's based on subjective ratings by the individual rating their energy levels, and it's heavily influenced by the factor you mentioned before, that people normalize to their energy levels.
Yes.
And so, people in general just think whatever their energy is, unless they're like severely debilitated in terms of their fatigue, they tend to think that whatever their level of energy is relatively normal.
Yeah. So, I mean, if anything, it's likely that these values are underappreciating the true impact overweight and obesity has. And I guess the first and in what in my opinion is the strongest argument for this position isn't based in any research. It's actually just based in common sense. So for everyone listening, especially if you are someone who is interested in fat loss and who currently has some extra weight to lose, um, let's say that you need to lose 50 pounds. I want you to imagine the flip side of that situation. I want you to imagine being at like a normal body weight and literally having to wear a 50-pound weight vest for the entire day, no matter what you do. Like every step you take, every movement that you make, you're going to be bogged down by 50 pounds of extra weight. That alone is going to make you tired.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's like, that's, I feel like that alone really helps illustrate kind of at a high level how big of an impact weight loss would have. Like you spend years wearing that 50-pound weight vest day after day. This is one of the reasons why you want to sit down so much, by the way, and why you want to be less active is because you have all this excess weight on your joints and it's uncomfortable. And then suddenly one day you just take it off. Imagine how light you would feel, how energetic, how much desire to move you would have after being bogged down after all of that.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
so it's like, well, yeah, we have a bunch of actual research that supports this obesity fatigue connection, but I just that more high level logical way of looking at it, I think is really the best way to just picture how good you would feel after some fat loss in terms of your energy levels.
Yeah. There's an interesting confounding variable there that's worth mentioning that is linked with both, you could argue, fatigue and as well as that linked with increased risk or susceptibility to gaining fat. And that is genetics as it relates to NEAT, non-exercise activity thermogenesis. And Dr. James Levine has been instrumental in his work, his research around the subject. But one of the interesting things they've done, I'm sure you've seen this study or we've maybe talked about it in the past, the twin study, where they've
Yeah.
done around intentional overfeeding. And basically, they found that certain people are genetically more susceptible to gaining weight. And a big portion of what explains that is some people are genetically wired to respond to periods of a caloric surplus of overconsumption of food relative to what their body needs um, by unconsciously um, or non-consciously, I should say, uh, expending more energy through fidgeting, through getting up, through moving your body. And that concept very much relates to energy. The drive to energy is like to move your body, to get up off the couch and move, as opposed to stay seated on the couch. So anyway, it's worth mentioning that just genetically, some people are kind of predisposed to not getting obese because of that sort of increased energy and drive to move their body, as opposed to people who are more susceptible to, during periods of overfeeding, to just storing the excess calories as fat on their body and not moving and burning it off. Anyway, I thought it was an interesting side point, maybe worth adding to the mix. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I definitely think that's an interesting side point that's worth consideration. And I would throw into that also consideration that could be a contributor to fatigue in and of itself
Mm-hmm.
too, right? So this continues our theme of complexity here. But like you had just said, some people, when you like just chronically overeat, some people will fidget it away and they might just be more revved up people. They might have more desires to move. But a huge component of NEAT is doing things like shaking when you don't realize that you're shaking, or twitching your legs and your muscles, because these are just like unconsciously controlled mechanisms. So rather than desires to move, it also involves those little things. And in people where, I mean, the surplus is small and where their level of need is so high, it could siphon away energy and almost make it like they're in a chronic energy deficit, so to speak, to where in order to resolve their fatigue, you know, I somewhat like ironically, maybe all they need to do is eat more food. And that's just because the way that they're wired up genetically makes them kind of waste a lot of energy doing pointless movement. And it doesn't leave a lot of energy for other things, or it just makes them tired more than they would be otherwise.
Yeah.
Um,
Interesting. Good stuff. So if we were to outline the mechanisms of how one's body fatness relates to energy levels, what would you say are the key mechanisms at play there?
I would argue that the fundamental mechanism involved is the promotion of a state of chronic low-grade inflammation, and that it is through this mechanism that other aspects either then feed into that inflammation, for example, sleep disruption, or that mechanism itself, the low-grade inflammation, is what causes things like mitochondrial dysfunction, which then amplify fatigue. But I would argue kind of the centerpiece with obesity is being in the state of chronic low-grade inflammation. And I guess the reason that I believe that is because we have numerous studies in a bunch of different pathologies: cancer, type 2 diabetes, chronic fatigue syndrome, multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, and even people that have dysbiosis of their microbiome. Studies that associate fatigue severity with the extent of inflammation they're dealing with.
Mhm.
And so, I mean, even in people that don't have chronic low-grade inflammation, whatever amount of inflammation they do have is an independent predictor of their level of fatigue. And so then you have investigations and you have questions that ask, okay, so then if this link exists, how does inflammation cause fatigue? And there's really three main ways that does it. One, it alters neurotransmitter and reward pathways in your brain, which controls all behavior. It causes mitochondrial dysfunction, and it disrupts sleep, which then feeds back into it. So this first one's the most important because this is the one that comes from our evolutionary history, okay? It's something called sickness behavior. So a lot of you listening probably have a pet, or at the very least, you've witnessed this with yourself or a family member, because whether it be one of our pet animals or, you know, another human, it occurs all the same. And what happens when you experience some form of physical trauma, like you injure yourself, or you get an infection like the flu or the common cold? What happens to your energy levels? They disappear, right? Like you just naturally get more fatigued. Your animals move around less. You just want to kind of stay in bed, or, you know, you can't really work like you would prefer and you just mope around the house. And that's called sickness behavior. And it's the result of inflammatory cytokines from battling an infection or working to heal an injury and fight off any pathogens that are trying to get in through the injury. Those cytokines pass through the blood-brain barrier and bind to specific receptors on the brain that cause this alteration of your behavioral state that is called sickness behavior, where your brain then just kind of tells the rest of your body, hey, we're gonna, you know, we might have a fever, we're not gonna eat, you're gonna demonstrate some symptoms of anorexia, we're kind of just gonna waste away with a little cachexia, we're gonna be fatigued and lethargic. And that's because we need to take literally every resource we have and focus it on healing, regeneration, battling pathogens, that type of thing. So, and we've had this throughout evolutionary history. Inflammation hits your brain and causes you to be fatigued for good reason. But that was always short-lived throughout evolutionary history. And that the number one reason why being overweight or obese
Well, actually, before you jump there, just why was it short-lived? Like, just explain that layer so people
Oh
know.
yeah. Okay, so short-lived because if you injured yourself, that wound is going to heal. And if you got an infection, then either you resolved the infection and you were no longer sick and you went on to continue your life, or you died. It wasn't like something that just stuck with you forever.
Mm-hmm.
But now in the modern environment, people with overweight or obesity have a state of chronic low-grade inflammation. And that means that they have elevated levels of inflammatory cytokines that enter into their brain and give them a kind of subclinical form of this sickness behavior,
Mm-hmm.
where they become more lethargic and fatigued because their brain thinks that it needs to divert resources elsewhere, when in reality, the individual just needs to lose a little fat mass.
Right. So it's basically it's the equivalent of if you had some kind of chronic injury, um, you had a gash open by some kind of wild animal that attacked you, and now you're healing this wound, and you have elevated levels of systemic inflammation as a result of that. And instead of that wound just healing in a week or two and then you getting back to normal, now you have that chemical milieu in your bloodstream basically all the time on an ongoing basis. So your brain's getting the signal, you need to rest because we need to divert, energy to healing what's wrong in the body. But I was going to say nothing's wrong in the body, but that's also kind of a misnomer. Something's wrong. It's just not something that sort of heals on its own easily.
Yeah, exactly. You summed it up perfectly. And so I'm going to skip over mitochondrial dysfunction and come to that one last, because I think that this is really the kind of perfect time to actually jump into sleep, because there's some really fascinating research, in my opinion, on sleep. And so we know that being overweight or obese also disrupts sleep. I mean, people with obesity are at a profoundly greater risk of having sleep apnea. And one reason for that is because structurally, they have excess fat on their throat that interferes with their breathing airways. And the second one is that state of chronic low-grade inflammation inflames their airways, so it makes it constricts the airway and makes breathing more difficult. So obesity is one of the most powerful independent risk factors for obstructive sleep apnea. And I mean, if you ask anyone that has obesity, you know how's your sleep, most of the time they're going to tell you they don't sleep well, and that's why. But the reason that that's fascinating when it comes back to this sickness behavior that's induced by inflammation entering into the brain is because we have research showing that sleep deprivation and just getting regular poor quality sleep increases the permeability of the blood-brain barrier, which means that at any given amount of inflammation you have in your blood, more of those inflammatory signaling molecules are going to be able to get through and bind to the receptors on your brain. So the inflammation and the obesity contributes to sleep disruption, which in turn contributes to an amplified fatiguing effect of the inflammation that's always there.
Mm-hmm. And you also, I mean, there's so many other mechanisms occurring simultaneously that are also influencing energy levels. I was going to jump to mitochondria, but we're going to save that one. So how sleep connects to energy in other ways, you have this connection of, for example, how sleep relates to hormones, and hormones like leptin and thyroid
Yep.
hormone, and testosterone and cortisol, and it's influencing the regulation of all of those because many of those hormones are diurnal and impacted by the circadian rhythm. So we know that sleep deprivation or poor sleep is going to influence now the hormonal milieu. It's going to influence neurotransmitters in the brain, and it's also going to influence things like autophagy. The basically cellular renewal, the repairing and recycling of damaged, worn out, broken down cell parts, and the rebuilding of new ones that occurs during the sleep period. So if you're not sleeping enough or your sleep is not high enough quality, it's going to impair that process. It's going to impair the clearance of toxins from the brain. We know there's this recently discovered glymphatic system that sort of purges toxins from the brain at night. You have all these other different layers to the story. And then of course, sleep is vital for mitochondrial health, but I think we'll maybe save that one.
Well, I think we'll get to that one here, in pretty quick. But I also want to add too that sleep is vital to not just mitochondria, but to a healthy body composition. And I mean, like in the Fat Loss Blueprint program, we have an entire module on sleep and circadian rhythms, just like you have an entire one in the Energy Blueprint program, because it's so essential for both energy levels, but also body composition. I mean, in that vein, like we have research showing that under completely identical conditions, sleeping for 5 to 5.5 hours per night causes 2/3 of your weight loss to come from lean tissue, compared to 2/3 of your weight loss coming from fat mass if you get 7.5 hours per night. And this is like under otherwise identical conditions in people living in a laboratory as the experiment's being conducted.
Right. So what you're getting at here is there's a vicious cycle taking place,
yeah,
which is having increased body fatness is likely to disrupt your sleep. Having disrupted sleep is therefore then likely to contribute to further increases in body fatness because of the mechanism you just mentioned. I'll also mention one other mechanism apart from disrupting the hormonal environment. But it also, this is related actually to the disruptions of the hormonal environment. Sleep disruption is linked with disturbance in leptin, and leptin is a key hormone in the regulation of body fatness, as well as ghrelin, which is a key hunger hormone, and also dysregulation of the endocannabinoid system, which also impacts on food cravings and appetite regulation. So the end result of those alterations in those different systems is there's research showing that sleep disruption dramatically increases overall appetite for food and also specifically increases cravings for sugar and fat-rich processed food. And there's even research showing that like a night of sleep disruption led people to consume, I think, between 300 and 500 more calories the following day. So at the same time, you have the mechanism that you just mentioned, increased loss of muscle mass, decreased loss of fat mass. You now have increases in appetite and all these alterations in the hormonal environment that are predisposing you to eat more and move less.
Yeah, exactly. And so, I mean, again, when we're like talking about these topics and you're sitting there thinking to yourself, wow, where do I start? Pick whichever one that you're doing the worst on, because they are all interconnected. So if you are overweight or obese, but you're also a really horrible sleeper, it's going to take you a lot more effort to get yourself down to a normal body composition than it is to just start facilitating a healthy sleep practices and a healthy environment for getting adequate sleep. So it's like, just start sleeping better and you'll start to see that repayment in like lower body fat and higher energy levels. But they are all interconnected.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's jump to mitochondria at this point. So explain the link between obesity and mitochondrial function. And by the way, I just want to quickly mention the previous podcast that I did with Alex maybe 2 months ago, something like that, was on the obesity immune function link. And we explored a lot of fascinating research around how increased levels of body fatness, mainly through this mechanism of increasing chronic inflammation in the body, contribute to immune senescence and basically immune system dysfunction. Of course, we know from research all around the world now that increased body fatness is a major predisposing factor to increase susceptibility to COVID. So that's an interesting other podcast for people to explore if you want to explore the immune side of things and how that relates to body fatness. But let's now jump into the mitochondrial piece and how that relates to the energy and body fatness connection.
Yeah. So, I mean, coming off the heels of this idea of sickness behavior, kind of like, so on the one hand, you have your brain literally telling your body to stop moving around. And as if that wasn't bad enough, then you have these mitochondria throughout your body, in your muscles, in the things responsible for moving you around, that are saying, hey, we're a little broken right now. We can't do what you want us to. And that stems primarily from this, again, low-grade state of inflammation. We have a mountain of data showing that chronic low-grade inflammation leads to mitochondrial dysfunction and reduced energy production. So, I mean, you know, it really is as simple as it sounds in that regard, in the sense that obesity causes mitochondrial dysfunction. Mitochondria are the primary energy production plants of your body. They're what are used to meet the energy needs of almost every cell in the body, especially at rest. There are exceptions when you exercise at high intensities. And so if your mitochondria cannot make energy efficiently, then you are going to be at a deficit of energy, and your body is going to start compensating for that by downregulating energetically costly processes. And that includes movement, because if your mitochondria can only pump out, you know, just let's say 5 energies every minute, and your body can get you down to 4 energies per minute just by making you want to take the escalator instead of the stairs, then your body's going, then that's what you're going to do. And you're not even going to be consciously aware of this. You're going to suddenly stop fidgeting. You're not going to be burning off several hundred extra calories each day by shaking your hands or twitching your leg when you're not even aware of it, because your body's suddenly going to realize, hey, we can't put energy towards those processes, so we're going to shut them off. And you can fix all this by restoring mitochondrial function. And there's a lot of different ways to do that, obviously losing fat mass being one of them. But this comes back into your energy blueprint program as well. And I think that, I mean, I'm not as well versed in that literature with chronic fatigue and mitochondria as you are, Ari, but I feel like I almost never see it talked about outside of like the circle of individuals, including yourself. I feel like this link is so well known. Like if you look at people that have diseases of their mitochondria, like actual genetic mutations of their mitochondria that cause mitochondrial dysfunction, and you compare them to individuals with chronic fatigue, you see almost like identical patterns of fatigue scores. I mean, so I guess I feel like the mitochondria are a very underappreciated contributor to fatigue, and that it should be talked about more, but I never see it talked about more. Why is that?
Yeah, well, the old paradigm around mitochondria was really like mitochondria are these sort of mindless energy generators that just sort of take in carbs and fats and then pump out ATP, cellular energy. And in that sort of paradigm, like if that is your conception of energy, then how would we increase energy levels? Well, like take in more carbs and fats. And yet we know that that doesn't reliably, increase energy. So we know that this story of mitochondria is more complex than simply just take in more food and that leads to more energy. And in fact, taking in too much food, more than what your body needs, actually leads to lower energy levels. So what's going on there is very complex, but the best way to understand it is this shift from viewing mitochondria as these sort of mindless energy generators, as we learned in high school and college biology courses, to the new paradigm, which is largely built out thanks to a brilliant researcher named Dr. Robert Naviaux, and the cell danger response. And in his words, mitochondria are the hub of the wheel of metabolism, and they are actually regulating. They're not just mindless energy generators, but they are actually environmental sensors that are regulating energy production in response to the signals they're getting from the environment. So when the body is under threat, it initiates sickness behavior. And part of that is the brain mechanism that you've brilliantly outlined so far. And the other part of it is mitochondria are also sensors that are regulating energy levels and energy production in response to that. So these signals from the environment are translated into, whether it's sleep deprivation, whether it's psychological stress, whether it's a crappy diet, and eating too much McDonald's and soda and French fries, or whether it's, circadian rhythm disruption, or whatever the source, whether it's toxins, whatever the source of stress is, all of that gets translated into some kind of biochemical milieu that is sensed by the mitochondria. So that might be, let's say, you've got poor gut health and leaky gut. Now you've got increased LPS lipopolysaccharide leaking into your bloodstream, which has been shown to damage mitochondrial function and cause decreased energy production at the mitochondrial level. So this toxin is literally being essentially sensed by your mitochondria and translating that, like basically saying, oh, there's a stress present, there's a danger present. We need to shut down energy production and shift into defense mode. And these are, as Robert Naviaux has explained, these are two sides of the same coin. So mitochondria can either be doing one or the other, but they don't do both at the same time. So to the degree that you have danger signals present in your environment, whether it's from poor gut health, whether it's from a poor diet that is translated into increased inflammatory cytokines, whether it's increased psychological stress, toxin exposure, which translates often into the same kind of biochemical milieu of increased immune activation and inflammation, or whether you have increased body fatness, which, as you said, increases chronic levels of inflammation and inflammatory cytokines. Those inflammatory cytokines are literally being sensed by the mitochondria, and then the mitochondria are going, oh, we're under threat. We need to shift into danger mode, into fatigue mode, into sickness behavior. These are all kind of synonymous, and out of energy mode. So to the degree you have that stuff going on, your mitochondria will turn down energy production and switch more into defense mode.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you summed it up really well. And I guess the one thing that you jogged my memory on that I want to add here at the end too, is that researchers have actually done like the link between mitochondria and fatigue in the literature, regardless. So I don't think that link is prevalent out on like the interwebs, or certainly not in conventional practices. I mean, I didn't even really know about it until I met you and started following your work and conversing with you about it. But I'm incredibly surprised with, you think about how few people are aware of it and how little it's acted upon in like conventional medicine, and then the extent of research that's on it in, like, you search on PubMed and there are thousands and thousands of studies on this thing, and researchers have systematically reviewed studies that look at mitochondrial function in people with chronic fatigue and relate it to their fatigue severity. And they show that like people that suffer from chronic fatigue have consistent deficits in things like carnitine, which they need to shuttle fatty acids across the mitochondrial membrane. CoQ10, which is not only an antioxidant, but is an electron transporter in the energy production chain. Lower concentrations of mitochondrial antioxidants and higher levels of oxidative stress. They have, and changes in like gene expression in the functional pathways for energy production, such as those related to protein transport and mitochondrial morphology. So there's, in my opinion, a very, very clear link between mitochondrial dysfunction in all the ways it can present and fatigue. And there's also a very, very clear link between low-grade chronic inflammation and mitochondrial dysfunction. And there's also a very, very clear link between being overweight or obese and having chronic low-grade inflammation. And then it all circles back, because then there's also a very, very clear link between mitochondrial dysfunction and fatigue with overweight and obesity. And you can see, kind of like we had talked about with sleep a little earlier, this vicious cycle where, you're overweight or obese. It impairs mitochondrial function, which makes you tired, which contributes to being overweight or obese, which perpetuates the problem. And so it's almost like you have these dualities going on, where on the one hand, you have the chronic inflammation mitochondrial cycle. And on the other hand, you have the like obesity, like chronic inflammation, sleep loss cycle. And then you even have a third one actually, where it's the sleep loss mitochondrial dysfunction cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like they all just spin together, where as soon as you like become overweight or obese, all these cycles start spinning and feeding into one another. And you really need to take steps to address each one.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So with all of that said, I think that's probably adequate explanation of the mechanisms behind what's going on to explain this link between body fatness and fatigue. So at this point, let's go practical. What is the solution? I mean, it should be fairly obvious at this point, but what, well, let's just say it. What is the solution to all of these problems and all of these vicious cycles that are occurring?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of solutions that you could take, but I mean, at the fundamental level, kind of how we started this, losing fat is going to positively impact everything else. It's going to lower inflammation, which will improve mitochondrial function. It's going to improve sleep quality, which is going to improve mitochondrial function. All of that's going to improve energy levels. You're, finally going to be able to take off that 50 or 100-pound weight vest that you've been lugging around for the last, who knows, couple decades. Your energy levels are going to skyrocket by losing fat mass. Now, that's like the simple answer. And I mean, kind of the question above and beyond that is, well, how do I do that?
Mm-hmm.
And
obviously we've built a program recently, the Fat Loss Blueprint, that we just launched a little over 2 months ago for the first time, which is an epic program, and we've had amazing feedback on it. But having said that, the Fat Loss Blueprint is really more of an advanced program. In fact, I was originally planning on titling it Advanced Fat Loss Strategies, to specifically explain that this is not the basics. This is not the same old stuff that everybody's heard before. This is really, once you've got the foundational fat loss strategies dialed in, you've got a basic diet plan, and good nutrition in place, and an exercise regimen and so on. What are the advanced level strategies to take your results to the next level? So that's what that program is all about. But let's kind of give us a practical tour into what are the key strategies for fat loss.
So yeah, this is for people that have the fundamentals down. But that being said, we do have, right after we kind of introduce what the program's all about and what you can expect to benefit from it, our second lesson plan does actually touch on those fundamentals we expect you to have. And the reason we do that, the reason it's advanced, is because we don't spend a lot of time on these topics. But that doesn't mean we're just going to leave you high and dry. We do expand on them. And so at a high level, for everyone listening, if you needed a place to start, I think it's rather simple. First and foremost, you need to acknowledge that you need to be in a chronic energy deficit. Now, how you achieve that, I mean, a million different ways you can do that. But you need to acknowledge that chronic energy deficit needs to exist. And, the 18 lesson plans we have in the program outlines like these more advanced strategies you can use to kind of hack that energy deficit and make it easier to obtain and larger than it would be otherwise without added effort on your part.
Yeah. Well, Alex, let's forget the program itself for a second, and let's just talk practical strategies for fat loss right now. So what do those fundamentals look like? If you were to sort of quickly summarize that. And I also want to ask, though this is something that we delved into in great depth, I think in the first podcast we did, on the subject of energy deficit, calorie deficit. There are some people out there promoting right now, and for the last several years, like all of the calories in, calories out stuff is nonsense. Really, calories don't matter. Really, it's about hormones and it's about insulin and that sort of model of things. And again, we covered that in depth in the first podcast, but do you have any quick words for anybody listening to this who's kind of thinking along those lines and saying, oh, this guy believes in, calorie deficits. Clearly he's not up to date on the latest research. What would you say in response to that?
I would say that I think people confuse like theoretical models with practical applications. So from a theoretical model standpoint, it's rather clear that you need an energy deficit to lose fat mass. But that doesn't mean that, just telling people to eat less and move more is an effective practical strategy, because it's not even close. And on the other hand, just to kind of appeal to all the people that think that things like insulin are the drivers of fat loss, like from that theoretical perspective, insulin is irrelevant. People can lose fat eating high carbohydrate diets. They can. That's been shown consistently in the literature. But a low carbohydrate diet may be the ideal diet for you because you find it lets you obtain an energy deficit, in an easy way by reducing your hunger more than other dietary patterns, or by, increasing your energy levels more than other dietary patterns may. Or maybe it's just the one dietary pattern you're able to adhere to and enjoy. Mm-hmm. And so I think that people get those two things mixed up. Like the fundamental theoretical tenet of fat loss is you need a chronic energy deficit, but there's a lot of different ways to practically implement that theory. And just telling people again to eat less and move more doesn't work. But telling them maybe to stop eating carbohydrates, that does work. But that doesn't mean that insulin was preventing your fat loss. It just means that you needed a different practical approach to achieving that energy deficit.
Mm-hmm. Just for the sake of argument, what if I was to, let's say I burn off 3,000 calories every day. What if I was to consume 3,000 calories on a diet that has lots of carbs and my insulin levels are high versus the same 3,000 calories, but on a diet where my insulin levels are very low? It's a low carb, ketogenic diet. What kinds of differences would it make to my weight loss by having insulin be higher or lower after my meals in those two states?
Well, at a simple level, it wouldn't make any difference. And at the slightly more complex level, you would actually probably do better on the high carb diet, because carbohydrates stimulate increases in energy expenditure more than fats do. And so if your maintenance was 3,000 and you ate mostly carbohydrates, then your new maintenance might actually be 3,200 calories instead of 3,000, which means you would actually be in a deficit despite eating that 3,000 calories you thought was your maintenance, because your body adapts and it shoots off a lot of those carbs as heat. But for all intents and purposes, it doesn't matter.
So now add a third layer to that, which is, if what you're saying is true, then how can we explain how people can consume low carb or keto diets and lose lots of weight and, have an experience like it's a great weight loss diet?
Well, in the first week or two, all of that weight is mostly water because they're losing glycogen. And every molecule of glycogen requires at minimum 2.5 grams of water to store it. So if you lose several hundred grams of glycogen, that's like, 2 to 5 pounds of water that leaves your body in the first week. After that, it's just a chronic energy deficit. Low carb diet squashes your appetite, makes it easier to adhere to the diet, cuts out a bunch of junk food, because a lot of junk food's high in carbohydrate. And if you're not eating carbs, you're not eating the junk food, which means you're eating less calories than you might think you are.
Mm-hmm. So at equal levels of calories, high carb versus low carb, zero difference in fat loss, basically.
Yep.
But
yeah,
in at least some people, consuming a diet that is low carb or keto can potentially decrease their overall appetite, so that if they're in that scenario I mentioned before of burning and consuming 3,000 calories, now they might non-consciously decrease their calorie intake down to 2,400 calories course, 2,200 calories. And as a result of that, even though they were not conscious of, doing it intentionally to manipulate their calorie intake, that happened just as a result of how the foods that they were consuming influenced their appetite regulation and satiety. Now they've got an energy deficit that is going to lead to fat loss. Is that accurate?
Yeah, 100%. And I would also, low carb diets tend to result in higher amounts of protein intake because you're eating more foods that just contain more protein naturally. And we have, like, protein's the one macronutrient where consistently high protein diets lead to more favorable changes in body composition than lower protein diets. And so if you're someone who's eating at the low end of protein, you decide to go low carb, your protein's probably going to go up, and that's probably going to be a huge factor in your success in terms of lower appetite and, greater muscle mass and greater fat loss.
Mm-hmm. As far as studies, or just people's experiences on low carb versus low fat diets, how big of an explanatory factor do you think protein intake is?
I think protein's huge, to the point where any study at this point in time, like, if you want to assess the effect of a diet, you need to control variables, right? To make sure that you can actually isolate the effect you're looking for. Calories are pretty obvious. If people want to compare low carb and low fat diets, you need to have calories be the same, or to see what effects it has on health markers or weight loss, that type of thing, right? It's also now at the point where you not only need to equate calories to make the diets relatively equal, so to speak, you need to equate their protein content, because the data is so overwhelming that if you're comparing two diets that differ in their protein content, the one that's higher in protein is probably going to have a more favorable effect on your weight loss.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Okay, so on a practical level, how does one implement that information with regards to protein? How can one use the fact that protein is important to weight loss as a strategy to improve their results?
I would say that if you're going to start anywhere, take a little time to figure out what you're eating and how many grams of protein you're eating, and then work to optimize your protein intake. Because we have meta-analyses of numerous studies showing that, for example, if you're overweight or obese, take however much you weigh and eat roughly, like in pounds, take however much you weigh in pounds and eat about 0.5 to 0.7 grams of protein for every pound of body weight that you are currently. And that's going to optimize your fat loss compared to eating less protein. Maybe there's an additive benefit from eating even more protein than that, but studies haven't really gone up that high, so we can't say for certain.
And so when somebody does that task of actually sitting down to calculate the amount of protein that they have in their diet, going on an app like MyFitnessPal or Chronometer and plugging in what they ate for the last couple of days, what is the experience or the realization that most people have when it comes to their protein intake after doing that?
Their realization is usually, oh my God, I've been eating so little protein. And that's been a universal finding in our private Fat Loss Blueprint Facebook group, is that people are just amazed. They're like, I didn't realize this. Mm-hmm. And then what's funny is then they start adding protein. Like, they're not even removing foods from their diet. They just start adding protein in. And suddenly they're like, I can't eat anymore. I am so full. And they just start automatically kind of pushing out other foods because they're so satiated now that they've increased their protein. And then fat loss ensues. And they're just surprised that it's like, I didn't realize it was this easy. I'm not even hungry.
Yeah, and this point is just worth emphasizing to the extreme, because the major reasons, it's been shown, the major reasons people will fail to stick to a weight loss regimen. The two major factors that predispose to that are hunger pangs, chronic hunger, and low energy, fatigue. So if you're relying on a weight loss regimen that's just about deprivation and restricting calories or restricting different food groups, and you're chronically hungry and low energy, it's just a matter of time before you go back to your old ways, and then the whole thing was just a waste of time. So it's just worth emphasizing that approaching things first by adding in protein rather than just removing stuff and restricting is just vital, because now you're actually eliminating one of the big predisposing factors to why people fail to sustain their weight loss, which is the hunger piece of the puzzle. And eliminating that, just, it's massive. So protein is just a huge factor here.
Yeah, exactly.
So beyond that, what is another key tenet of effective, lasting, sustainable fat loss? And
Well, I think
I want to just add one layer here, which is, if you have, you know, if we took prisoners of war, just for the sake of a thought of experiment, I don't plan on doing this anytime soon. But let's just say we took a bunch of people who were listening to this, and we captured them, and we put them in some kind of camp, and we got to control entirely what they were consuming, you know, the food that they were eating. Weight loss in that kind of scenario becomes unbelievably simple. We can cause people to lose as much weight as we want by simply starving them.
Yeah.
Okay. And so weight loss in this sense is actually extraordinarily simple. Any monkey can, you know, figure out how to tell somebody to go on a calorie deprivation diet and restrict their calories and starve themselves. And the tricky and insidious part of that is it works kind of initially, and then it doesn't work. And then when it doesn't work, you can then blame the individual and say, oh, it's your failure of willpower to stick to the regimen, because we know that, you know, weight loss is as simple as calorie deprivation. But in the real world setting, when you don't have people who are your prisoners that you can just starve, and people actually are listening to their cues from their body and the hormones that regulate body fatness and appetite, now all of a sudden, weight loss becomes an enormously more complex problem that is way harder to solve in a real world context that is sustainable, that is lasting, that is permanent. And so that distinction, I think, cannot be understated. But what are the core tenets of a paradigm of fat loss that is lasting and sustainable and permanent, that doesn't just tell people to go on some kind of wacky, extreme calorie deprivation or other kind of deprivation diet? So you mentioned protein at this point. What else?
Well, okay, so we got protein. The other one kind of plays into what we were saying about low carb diets and low fat diets. And that's like, you need to find a diet that you can stick with, right? If your best friend's on a low carb diet and they're doing great, and you're just like, I don't like any of the food on this diet, I just can't do it. Don't try to force yourself to do that diet. Like, when you're going for fat loss, it needs to be something you can do for the rest of your life, right? You like Yoni Friedhoff says, you need the habits to lose fat you need to be able to do for the rest of your life to keep the fat off. And so, I mean, I would say that's another kind of fundamental tenet, is pick a diet that works for you. Mm-hmm. And it's not going to be the same as works for everyone else. Everyone's going to have their own preferences. And so you need to find a way to work with your preferences so that you enjoy the process.
Yeah. And I love this point. And at the risk of maybe introducing too much nuance and complexity here, I want to add that there's actually research, it's kind of counterintuitive, I think, probably for both you and I. There's research showing that, and this is a mutual friend of ours, Spencer Nadolsky, linked me to this research when I was discussing it with him on a podcast we did a couple of years ago. But basically looking at people's dietary preferences, the kinds of foods that a person prefers, and if choosing a diet based on foods that that a person prefers leads to better long-term outcomes, fat loss outcomes, and sustainability. And it didn't really. And I think the confounding variable in here, and there's sort of two layers that need to be juxtaposed. One is the layer you mentioned, that yes, you have to choose a dietary pattern that you can sustain, that you like enough to keep doing, and that doesn't cause you so much psychological stress where you chronically feel deprived or you feel hungry or you feel low energy or something like that. At the same time, it also probably needs to be relatively scarce in foods that you really love.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like,
That's a really good point.
probably needs to be a diet that is not really rich in pizza and donuts and ice cream.
Yeah.
So, you know, there's a sort of balance in between those two extremes of, it shouldn't be something that's so extreme where you just hate your diet and you despise the meals that you're consuming. And it also shouldn't be something that's so extreme where you just can't wait to sit down to eat your meals because you're so looking forward to getting to indulge in those delicious foods and you're thinking
Yeah.
about it for hours before your meal.
Well, this actually plays into another kind of fundamental tenet that I wanted to mention too, is that your diet needs to be based around mostly whole foods. And this kind of solves that problem, right? Because like the standard Western diet, the standard American diet, there's a reason why 3/4 of the population is overweight or obese. It's because their diet is full of ultra processed, hyper palatable, high fat, high carbohydrate foods that just override all of your body's inborn satiety signaling mechanisms and facilitate eat more and gain weight and then continue to eat.
And eat for pleasure. Forget about even listening to your hunger signals and your satiety signals. You're now eating because your brain gets a hit of pleasure by
Yeah.
consuming those really delicious foods.
Well, yeah, so the foods are basically drugged.
Like, biology actually literally gets shifted towards what's called hedonic eating instead of homeostatic eating, right? You're eating to give yourself like entertainment and pleasure instead of just operating, as most animal species do, where they're not eating so much for pleasure, they're eating because their body requires those nutrients.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I think it was in 2019. It might have been earlier this year, but but I can't remember. Point is, within like the last year or two, Kevin Hall published, the obesity researcher Kevin Hall published that a study where he locked a bunch of adults inside a metabolic or inside his research institute and fed them, like controlled all their food intake.
So he did the experiment I was talking about, taking prisoners of war and starving them.
Yeah, right. No, he gave them food. He gave them two different diets. One diet was based like on pretty much all whole foods. The other diet was based on super processed, refined foods. But otherwise the macros were the same, like same fiber, same protein, same carbs, same fat. And he let the participants eat as much as they wanted. And what he found is that over the 2-week period, keeping in mind research, especially this type of inpatient research where they live in your research institute, very expensive. So you usually can't go on for super long periods of time. And that sucks, but that's just kind of a fact. For over 2 weeks.
The experiment where I like locked people in my basement for 3 years. And
yeah, right. To see what sunlight deprivation does.
Yeah.
Anyway, what he found is over 2 weeks, those who ate the whole food diet lost about 2 pounds, and those that ate the ultra processed diet gained about 2 pounds. And what was really interesting is that at the end of these two, throughout the experiment, the participants rated each diet equally satiating. So the hunger levels and appetite were the same on each diet, but the ultra processed diet, they ate about 500 calories more per day, which is what causes the weight gain. And so
I just want to add that this 2 pounds to people listening might seem insignificant. Oh, it's just 2 pounds. Keep in mind the context is a 2-week study.
Yeah.
And so just think about how something like that, an effect like that, would play out over time, right? Most people who are obese are 40, 50 pounds overweight, 80 pounds overweight. Just think how easy, if you can gain 2 pounds of fat in the context of 2 weeks, there's 52 weeks in a year, okay? Just extrapolating the math out, in a decade, let's say, over 500 weeks, would it be possible in the span of 10 years from the time you go from being in high school at 18 to 28 years old or 28 to 38, is it possible to gain 50 pounds or 80 pounds just from this one thing of how the processing, the degree of processing of the foods you're consuming are manipulating the hormonal environment that regulates your body fatness, your appetite, and your energy expenditure in a way that leads to, you know, the gain of 50 or 80 pounds in the span of a decade? Yeah, absolutely. Just this one factor by itself can explain the entire obesity epidemic.
Yeah, 100%. And again, what's really the most fascinating part about this experiment is, again, the similar satiety levels, which means that in order to achieve the same level of hunger suppression on each of these diets, you need 500 calories more of ultra processed food to get the same level of satiety as the whole foods diet. So, I mean, if we just flip it on its head, if you go from whatever you're eating now to eating a mostly whole foods diet, your hunger might not change, but you're more than likely going to spontaneously eat much fewer calories.
Beautiful. And that is just to, with the risk of redundancy, I just want to emphasize this further. That principle is literally the single most important principle when it comes to lasting sustainable fat loss. It just, you know, everybody who gets results has to rely on that. I won't say everybody, almost everybody who does things in a lasting, sustainable way, that they lose fat and they achieve it for years, they are relying on that fundamental principle. Whether they're eating a low carb diet or a high carb diet or a vegan diet or whatever the specifics are, that principle is at play of unprocessed whole foods. Now, within that, Alex, within this territory of unprocessing your diet, whole foods, you've mentioned protein as a key factor there. So we have whole foods, increased protein intake, optimizing at 0.5 to 0.7 grams per pound. What about the other foods? What about the carb to fat ratio? What about the specific food choices? Anything that you can say on that? And obviously, you know, we don't have 3 hours to delve into all of the details of all of the specifics of fat loss, but what's one key point on that subject that's worth emphasizing?
Okay, well, I guess, so if I had to think of one key point on that point to emphasize, frankly, I don't think it's worth worrying about where your carbs and your fats fall. I think it's, as long as you're eating mostly whole foods and making sure you hit your protein, then if you want to go on, like, again, that low carb diet, have at it. If you want to go on a low fat diet, have at it. If you want to have a little bit of each, that's fine too. People are successful on all of these types of diets. And that is evidence enough that any of them can work. It's just, you, again, you need to pick the one that you enjoy, provided you're eating mostly whole foods and your protein intake is satisfied. Now, that being said, I personally think that eating high fiber diets, ones that have an abundance of fibrous plants, are going to be a better long-term strategy. And we're not gonna dive into all the reasons why. It's just, I'll just mention that all of the abundance of phytochemicals you get from those plants, along with the fibers, have numerous beneficial effects on your microbiome and your total body health. Effects that we don't quite know what the long-term consequences of not having those foods in the diet are.
Okay, so I have two more layers I want to dive into. One is exercise, briefly. I want you to give me a quick summary of how to optimize exercise in the context of losing fat. And then the last thing I want to talk about is beyond just the diet and exercise story, because so much of what we do in the fat loss blueprint goes beyond just the standard diet and exercise stuff. I want you to mention at least one non-diet or exercise factor that influences fat loss.
Okay, so exercise. Stop thinking about it as a way to burn calories. Researchers have systematically reviewed studies that compare different modalities of diet and exercise interventions for weight loss. And they find that the biggest impact comes from those which provide the highest level of metabolic stress. It's a hormetic stressor. So resistance training is at the top. Why? Resistance training's like fundamentally the only way that you can build up muscle tissue beneath your body. When you think of fat loss, your goal, a lot of you have a picture in the head of what you want to look like when you lose fat, right? If you just lose fat along with all of your muscle, you're probably never going to achieve that image. You need to focus on things that not just facilitate fat loss, but also build up that metabolic muscle tissue beneath your skin to give you the appearance that many of you want and to contribute to your health. I mean, the loss of muscle mass with aging is like the leading cause of premature death. It's called sarcopenia. So muscle mass is very important. And resistance training is really the only modality of exercise you can do to build that up. So stop thinking about it like, okay, I have an hour to exercise. I'm going to burn more calories if I just run on the treadmill. No, like, yeah, you'll burn more calories, but so what? Use that time to do some resistance training if you don't already have a regular resistance training plan in place, because that's what's going to build up your muscle, make you healthier, and give you the body composition you want.
Mm-hmm. And in the context of, the dietary modifications that lead to an energy deficit, why is it important to do resistance exercise in that context as opposed to someone who just does cardio, for example?
Because it tells your body to either grow new muscle or preserve whatever muscle you have. And when you're dieting, your body is scrounging around for energy, because if you're not eating it, it has to get it from the body. And it will pull it from your muscle. And resistance training is the one way to actually build muscle, even though you're in an energy deficit. Whereas if you don't do any resistance training, you're going to lose muscle. The amount of muscle you lose will vary based on a variety of factors, but you 100% will lose muscle.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so last question is, give people at least one non-diet or exercise factor that is not very well known that influences their body fatness and their fat loss results.
Okay. I want to go with one that is just a personal pet favorite of mine, and it's going to be your mindset. I think that a lot of people get so focused on the tangible aspects of dieting. What can they manipulate about their exercise? What can they manipulate about their diet? What can they manipulate about their environment? That they never stop to turn all of that desire for change internally and think about, what can I manipulate about the way that I look at, my life, my body composition, and my approach to dieting? Because your mindset, your mind's always going to be there. And you can take people that have, for example, certain stressful events, and one person could absolutely freak out from that stress while the other person remains calm. You can have two people that, one person has a failure in their dieting adventure because they didn't meet some goal they set, whereas another person acknowledges the success they had along the way despite not meeting that goal. And the only difference between these people is their mindset. It's their mindset that determines how they deal with stress, how they deal with failure, and how they decide to move forward in their fat loss journey. And so I think that the dieting mindset is something that everyone would benefit from, not just becoming more aware of, but from using to understand what are some of the inborn cognitive biases the mind has, like the negativity bias. Why is it that I get so focused on every failure I make? Every time I fall off the dieting tracks, I get hyper focused on it and I feel like a failure. I feel bad. And then I just want to give up and I just figure, what's the point? Why is that? Well, it's called the negativity bias. You know, it's if you enter into a cave and a bear is living in there and almost kills you, you're going to remember that cave because you would die if you didn't. If you eat a poisonous plant, it's good if you remember what plant is poisonous because it could literally kill you. If you find honey, that's awesome, but it's not as important to remember because it's not a make it or break it situation. So we're designed from an evolutionary perspective to focus on negative events because they have more of an impact. They have the potential for more of an impact on our life. And just by simply acknowledging that one fact, you can start to say, this is why I keep focusing on all the tragedies of my dieting journey. And then you can say, okay, so now that I'm aware of why I'm doing this, it's not something that's wrong with me. That's normal. And so I don't feel as bad that it's happening now. And I can shift my focus from self-loathing to trying to identify positives in these situations. If things of that nature. And I just don't think that's talked about enough in the dieting world. I think that a lot of people approach dieting with completely immature mindsets, not immature, but just very innocent mindsets. They don't realize how much of an effect just shifting their perspective on a situation can have on their entire journey, not just their success rates, but on their enjoyment as they reach their goals.
Yeah, 100%. So to everybody listening, I want to mention, obviously, as we've alluded to, we've developed a program we launched about 10 weeks ago called the Fat Loss Blueprint. And you can find that at the energyblueprint.com/fat-loss-blueprint. So fat loss blueprint, just with little dashes or hyphens between the words, the energyblueprint.com/fat loss blueprint. So if you're interested in exploring this, if you're interested in getting this area of your life handled, if you're overweight and you don't want to suffer the consequences of that, and again, the previous podcast we did talks about the immune consequences. This podcast we talked about the energy or the fatigue consequences of being overweight. There's other consequences. I think we touched on them in the original podcast, just around overweight and the risk of other metabolic diseases, cardiovascular disease, many types of cancers, neurological diseases. The risk goes up with all kinds of diseases. So apart from any aesthetic body goals that you have, this is really an important area of your life to get handled as just the crux of your overall health and risk of many different diseases. Your experience of life, your energy levels, your mood depends heavily on your overall metabolic health, which very much hinges on your level of body fatness. So I encourage you all, if this is an area of your life that you feel motivated and inspired to take action on and to get handled, go check out the Fat Loss Blueprint. Again, it's really meant more for people who already have the basics in place, who already know the basics of good nutrition and exercise and so on. Who are ready to ramp things up and get some advanced fat loss strategies implemented in their life. So whether you take that up or not, I hope you enjoyed this podcast very much, and I hope you learned a lot from it, and I hope you go and start to apply this information in your life, and I hope you feel inspired to take action on this area of your life, because it is so important. It is something that is consequential. It's not something that just has no effect on you other than aesthetics. It's something that does have huge effects on you other than aesthetics. So, Alex, with all of that said, that's my wrap up. Do you want to offer any final words of wisdom, any words of inspiration, anything you want to say to wrap up?
Yeah. Don't give up. Fat loss is a journey. It's not a race. Don't compare yourself to other people. Figure out what you want to achieve. Compare yourself to your past self. If it's been an entire month and you've only lost 1 pound, 2 pounds, that's not a failure. You have lost 1 to 2 pounds. Maybe it's not at the rate you want. If so, what needs to change? But the point is compare your present self to your past self and just keep moving forward. Keep striving to make improvements. you will reach your goals. And we are here to help you if you decide that you need that help.
Beautiful. Brilliant. As always, my friend, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with our audience. To everybody listening, hope you enjoyed this. Hope you feel inspired to take action in your life. And I will see you in the next episode. Hey there, this is Ari again. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, if you found it valuable, please share it with your friends, share it with your family, help me get the word out there. Also, if you're on YouTube, make sure to hit the subscribe button and hit that little bell to get notifications every time we release a new video or new episode of the podcast. And if you're listening to this, make sure to subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or on your favorite podcast app. Thanks so much for supporting my work at the Energy Blueprint. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I will see you in the next one.